This year, 2018, is of course the centenary of the armistice that ended the Great War, an event so horrible that it changed the world's understanding of war. The First World War is kind of surprisingly forgotten in the United States, perhaps because the war to end all wars was followed so quickly by another great war. But as we use this anniversary to remember the sacrifices of the boys that we sent over there, we could take some time to think about what the war meant over here, because war changes a nation. The U.S. on the home front during the First World War says much about our people, our people who earnestly and deeply sacrificed for a cause that we almost universally agreed was just. But patriotism can be a double-edged sword, and war tugs at the very soul of a people. The lynching of Robert John Prager in the early morning hours of April 5th, 1918 represents exactly that conflict. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The U.S. home front during World War I was a quickly shifting sea of productivity and patriotic nationalism. President Woodrow Wilson had spent years telling Americans that the country should stay out of the war. But after German torpedoed the American merchant ship Housatonic in international waters on January 31st, 1917, President Wilson called a joint session of Congress, and the decision was made to enter the conflict. During Wilson's war message, delivered to Congress on February 3rd, 1917, he said, "Property can be paid for. The lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind." It took a federal committee to convince the American population to get behind World War I. Part of the country's hesitancy was because so much of the country's immigrant population consisted of Germans. The United States had the second highest German immigrant population in the world during this time period. About a third of the U.S. population as a whole was either an immigrant or had a parent who had been an immigrant. Nearly 5 million German immigrants became naturalized American citizens between 1850 and 1910. In addition to their high numbers, Germans had the reputations of being hardworking and industrious. It took a federal committee to galvanize the country into action to both support the war effort and turn against the German people. President Wilson formed the Committee on Public Information on April 14th and appointed journalist George Creel as its head. He called it a public relations committee, but Wilson's opponents believed it was more appropriately called a propaganda machine. The agency role was to release government news, to sustain morale in the U.S., to administer voluntary press censorship, and to develop propaganda abroad. One of its first acts was to create an informational brochure called What the Government Asks of the Press, and to distribute it to every publication in the nation. Creel wanted the press to cultivate a nation of patriots and patriotism, and so the distribution essentially asked publications to censor themselves. He also crafted press releases and required newspapers and magazines to print them, with some derisively called Creelings. The Committee on Public Information also created war posters to demonize Germany and warn the public about keeping an eye out for German spies. Germans were drawn as animalistic creatures who would stomp on babies and steal women while wading through spilt American blood. It was a smear campaign to make Americans fear the ravening Hun. Other posters encouraged young men to enlist, for the population at home to purchase Liberty bonds or other patriotic knickknacks to fuel the war effort. Liberty bond drives became a huge national push. Movie stars such as Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks stumped for the bonds, presenting their purchases as a patriotic thing to do. The country as a whole raised over $17 billion through benefits, parades, and multiple bond drives. But an attitude of suspicion was building as the country began to police itself through its publications and purchases. How much would a true patriot spend on Liberty bonds? Groups that didn't sell enough were investigated as potential hotspots for German spies. The pressure to not only do, but say the right things became heated. What would a true patriot be heard to say about the country and war effort? In Illinois, as well as in other states, self-policing efforts started to be used against anybody who didn't fit the mold of what appeared to be a perfect patriot. In the small town of Willsville, Illinois, community members hung a sign that said, "If you must speak the German lingo, go to Germany. We do not allow it spoken here. We are for Uncle Sam, and we insist that you speak the English language, now and forever." Stores owned by immigrants whose patriotism was questioned were painted yellow to represent what community members thought of the courage of those who wouldn't stand behind the U.S. war effort. But more than simple vandalism, those suspected of being German spies or sympathizers were tarred and feathered, had their heads shaved, were made to sing patriotic songs or kiss the flag to prove their loyalty. All of these different methods were used to try to shame people into compliance or silence. And into this volatile mix walked a headstrong and proud German immigrant. Robert Paul Prager was born in Germany in 1888 and immigrated to the United States at the age of 17. Prager was a small man, only around 5 foot 3 inches tall and weighing less than 170 pounds. At some point during his time in the U.S., he was accused of stealing a suit and had to spend 14 months in a reformatory in Indiana. During his incarceration, Prager got into a few fights and lost his left eye, which he replaced with a glass eyeball. After Wilson's War Declaration speech in 1917, Prager patriotically applied for naturalization papers the very next day. He tried to enlist to fight for his new country, but his missing eye prevented him from serving. Despite his past brush with the law, Prager seemed to be a kind but lonely man. He allowed neighborhood children to listen to music on his record player and gave them cookies and candy. He sent pictures of himself to mail-order brides in an effort to find a wife, and strived to improve his income by changing his job. Prager worked as a baker for a time in Nebraska and then in Collinsville, Illinois, at the Lorenzo Bruno Bakery. Bruno later said Prager had strong opinions and that they had a few disagreements, which probably made his decision to try a different job easier. A baker's wage was good, but in southern Illinois, a miner's wage was better. With coal production not because of the war effort and the union fighting for wages, it was a good time to be in the coal mining industry. To become part of the coal miners' union, an applicant had to prove he had worked for 4 years as a miner and get signatures of other union members to support his claim. Prager applied, though there is little evidence to prove that he ever worked as a coal miner. The union rejected his application because of his lack of experience, and when he also was accused of being a German spy, Prager's temper ignited. He penned a notice which he posted on the area mines and saloons which read, "I ask in the name of humanity to examine me to find out what is the reason I am kept out of work." Prager appealed to the men's union sensibilities. "I've been a union man at all times and never once a scab." Finally, he appealed to the miners as patriots. "I am heart and soul for the good old USA. I am of German birth, of which accident I cannot help." The miners, when they got off work or went for their daily drink, read the notices and rejected Prager's arguments. A drunken mob formed and went to Prager's shack. Apparently, they decided to drive the feisty German out of town. At around 10 p.m. on April 4th, they knocked on Prager's door and told him to leave the area. "All right, brothers, I'll go," Prager reportedly replied and began to gather his few belongings. He apparently didn't pack fast enough, however, because the crowd yelled for him to come out and kiss the flag. Again, Prager was game. He agreed to come out. "If you don't hurt me." The mob ripped Prager from his home and wrapped him in a large American flag. He was beaten and made to sing "We'll Fight for the Red, White, and Blue." The crowd removed his shoes and made him walk over broken glass and tacks in a torturous patriotic parade, with small boys gathering the sharp items and casting them in front of Prager again, forcing him to walk over them once more. The Collinsville mayor, John Siegel, saw Prager in the parade but was physically threatened by some of the mob's leaders. "Mr. Mayor, we dare you to defy the flag," they said, and Siegel backed down. He went instead to enlist the police's help. An officer named Fred Frost took the mayor's report and dashed into the unruly mob. He wrestled Prager from their grasp, yelling that he would lock the man up. The mob issued its protestations, but Frost didn't back down. Frost ran Prager into the jail and hid him, while Mayor Siegel tried to talk the mob into going home. Siegel also ordered the local saloons to close in an effort to remove the crowd's fuel, but as the bars shut, the drunken occupants joined those already in the street and rushed the jail. They found Prager cowering in the basement, hiding in a sewer pipe where the police had tried to conceal him. By all accounts, the mayor and the police made a sincere effort to protect Prager, but Siegel himself was of German ancestry, and the crowd started shouting that he was pro-German. The threat was clear. Again, they marched Prager down the town's main street, but this time their destination was a large tree. Some men from the group went looking for tar and feathers, but instead found a rope. When Prager saw what they intended, he fell to his knees and began to pray. Then his tormentors allowed him to write a final note to his family back in Germany. The note, which was given to a local newspaper editor by a mob leader, was published and said, "Dear parents, I must this day, 4/4/18, die. Please pray for us, my dear parents. This is my last letter or sign of life of mine. Your dear son and brother, Robert Paul." More than a dozen men pulled on the rope, and Prager suffocated to death at about 12:30 a.m. on the morning of April 5th. 11 men were indicted by a grand jury and tried in Edwardsville, Illinois, in May. In its concluding statements, the defense argued that Prager's lynching was justified by unwritten law, which does not allow unpatriotic talk. All 11 were found not guilty after mere minutes of deliberation. One of the members of the jury who acquitted the men was heard to say, "I guess nobody can say we aren't loyal now." The men posed in front of the courthouse with flags in their hands, while a band played patriotic music in the foyer. Author Peter Stamen, who wrote a comprehensive work on the lynching, said that despite many other examples of anti-German hysteria in the United States, this was the only example of Americans lynching a German immigrant during the First World War. And that's perhaps the biggest surprise, that there was only this one casualty, given that newspapers were stoking an atmosphere of suspicion and of unquestioned loyalty. The local Collinsville newspaper said of the lynching, "The entire community was convinced he was disloyal. The city does not miss him. The story of his death has had a wholesome effect upon the Germanists of Collinsville and the rest of the country." But their attitude was far from universal. In fact, the now famous photograph of the men in front of the courthouse waving American flags was altered in many American newspapers to blot out the flags, altered by editors who did not believe that these men should be able to hide their crimes behind America's flag. The St. Louis Star perhaps summed it up best. They said, "We must save our own soul as a nation." They editorialized, "We cannot hope to defeat the Hun if we become the Hun ourselves." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.